In this lesson, we will learn a bit more about CSS selectors. Now, there are many different types of selectors, but the big three that we will cover in this lesson are type selectors, descendant selectors, and class selectors. Let's begin with type selectors. So here is the example page from our previous lesson, and you'll remember that this is the CSS that we wrote. So it turns out you are actually already familiar with type selectors. A type selector is simply the name of an element, and it targets every element of that type on the page. So for example, when we created this rule, the rule that makes all paragraphs green, this selector of P is targeting every P element on the page. So it's targeting this paragraph, and this paragraph. That's a type selector. It's the most basic type of selector that there is. Let's move on to descendant selectors. Descendant selectors let us tap into the power of the Russian stacking doll model that HTML follows, the way that elements nest inside other elements. So for example, what if we only wanted to select, or we only wanted to style paragraph elements that are descendants, or in other words, that live inside the header element? So if we only wanted to select this paragraph, and we only wanted it to be green, we could adjust the selector for this rule to simply say header P. So if I save and refresh, we can see that now only this paragraph element is green. So let's review how this descendant selector is working. We start with header. So the web browser selects this header element. Then we include a space and P. So the web browser then looks inside this element for any and all paragraph elements. Now we can drill like this as many layers deep as we need to. So let's imagine that we want the word slogan to be blue. If the word slogan was wrapped in a span tag, we could create a new rule in our CSS file. So first, let's drill into the header element, then let's drill into the paragraph element, and then we'll finally select the span element, color blue. So if I save and refresh, you can see that that word is blue. So in a sense, you can think of the descendant selector almost like a type selector, but with a family tree twist. You can include names of ancestor elements until you finally drill down to the particular element that you want to style. So we've seen type selectors, we've seen descendant selectors. Now let's take a look at class selectors. Now in order to make this example clear, I'm going to edit the HTML a bit. Let's imagine that instead of only having one main body paragraph, we had at least 3. So copy and paste. So we now have 3 paragraphs in the body section. And let's imagine that for some reason we want this second paragraph, the middle paragraph, to have a yellow background. So how would we achieve that? Well, we can't use a type selector or a descendant selector because in terms of the HTML, there's nothing unique about this second paragraph. There's no way to distinguish it between the first or third paragraph. So what we can do to target this middle paragraph is give it a class. So in the HTML, on that element, we can add an attribute named class. And then we can give it any name that we'd like. So I will call this class name highlight. This class name is our key to selecting only this paragraph element. So in our CSS, we'll create a new rule that uses a class selector. So in order to target a class, you simply type a period and then the name of the class. So highlight. And then we can style it just like we would any other rule. Background color, yellow. So if we save and refresh, we can see that only the second paragraph has received that styling. Now the great thing about creating a class is that we now have this truly reusable block of code. So we can reuse this class anywhere in our HTML that we see fit. So let's imagine there was a second sentence in the footer. Let's add that really quickly. And let's imagine that second sentence read, all rights reserved. If we wanted this new sentence to have a yellow background, all we need to do is give it a class of highlight. So we can immediately see how useful it is to create classes that can be reused throughout our different pages. Now let's take things one step further. Let's imagine that we decide if a paragraph or an element has a class of highlight and it's in the main area of the page, we want it to have a yellow background. But if a paragraph is in the footer element and has a class of highlight, we instead want it to have a light gray background. Well, we can achieve just that by using a mix of descendant selectors and class selectors. So we'll begin by selecting the footer element, and then we'll dig into it and look for any element that has a class of highlight. And then we'll give it a background color of light gray. So here we can see that we have one class receiving two different styles because of the power of descendant selectors. So depending on where the element lives, we can style the same class differently. That's going to conclude this lesson. To review, we learned about type selectors, which select all elements of a specific type on the page. We learned about descendant selectors, which let us follow a path of ancestry to select a more particular element. And finally, we learned about class selectors, which let us create reusable bits of code that we can apply to any element. Now, there are far more than just 3 different types of CSS selectors. But there's no sense in trying to memorize all of the different ways to select elements in one sitting. We will learn about new selector methods as they become necessary. But for the time being, just these 3 types will get us quite far. In our next lesson, we will learn what the word cascade is implying in the phrase cascading style sheets. I'll see you in the next lesson.